You're listening to Scholé Sisters, episode number 79. Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, spreading my Charlotte Mason joy through blog posts, study guides, audios, and more. My co-host today is Misty Winkler. Misty is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. Have you joined the Scholé Sisters sistership yet? If not, you are missing out on some of the best conversations for classical homeschooling moms on the internet. Misty is leading a book study for Sophie level members through the liberal arts tradition right now. It's never too late to join because this study will always be available for Sophies in the form of a study guide. This is just one of the many benefits of a Sophie membership. Our guest today is Ravi Jain, who is now tied with Cindy Rollins for the Scholé Sisters title for most appearances, as today is his 3rd time on the show. Ravi Jain has a BA from Davidson College, an MA from Reformed Theological Seminary, and a graduate certificate in mathematics from the University of Central Florida. He co-authored The Liberal Arts Tradition with Kevin Clark, now translated into Chinese. Ravi currently teaches calculus, AP Calculus, and physics at the Geneva School in Orlando, Florida. He has given over 150 talks and workshops throughout America, Africa, and China on topics related to education, theology, mathematics, and science. He has served as a deacon in his church and is a founding Alcuin Fellow. He enjoys spending time with his 2 boys, Judah and Xavier, and his wife Kelley Anne, whom he met in Japan. Today's discussion is my favorite so far from this season because I finally got to ask Ravi Jain about a number of things I've been thinking about. His thoughts on things like multiculturalism and Western imperialism and how they relate to Christian classical education in general and the Christian classical school movement in China in particular are fascinating. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Misty, would you like to go first?
Sure. I am reading Quintilian. So that's been loads of fun. I'm reading The Orator's Education. Ooh. You know, we did our episode earlier this season on Quintilian and preschool. But in that, we were just reading the excerpts that are in the Great Tradition. Mm-hmm. And now I'm reading, I read all of those parts in context of the whole book. There are, I think, 12 books in the Orator's Education, and I am reading books 1, 2, and 10. This is assigned reading for a class I'm taking at New St. Andrews College, a grad class in the history of classical education. So we're starting off with Quintilian. And
interesting.
So good.
I might need to see your exact volume, like exactly what you bought, so I can buy the same book.
I bought the Loeb edition, which is funny because it's bilingual. It has the Latin on one page and the English on the other, as if but
just pretend you are. Fake it till you make it.
No, I totally agree, though. That would be a great book to have the Loeb edition on.
Well, what about you, Ravi? What are you reading lately? Or Misty, did I just cut you off? Are you?
No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. What you reading, Ravi?
Well, among my stacks, I think the book that is most needed to recommend right now is The Kingdom of Man by Remy Bragg. Have you guys heard of that one?
No.
Yeah, I don't know how he evaded my radar for some time, but I think he's been publishing a lot, at least over the past 8 or 10 years now. He's a professor at the Sorbonne. He's French. I think he's also maybe emeritus in Munich as a professor. But he's an unusual professor. I mean, he's Catholic, but he was a scholar of medieval Islam, perhaps.
Really?
Or medieval Arabic, one of the two. But also just a historian of thought and I think professor of philosophy. something like that. But he is brilliant. And the book is the third of a series where the other two, I picked up the other one called The Wisdom of the World a couple years ago. And then after that, one I haven't read, I think it's called The Law of God. And this one, The Kingdom of Man, is the third in the trilogy. And, he's in a lot of ways unpacking C.S. Lewis's argument from Abolition of Man that we have undone ourselves and we are about to take the final step where man himself is abolished. And, it's how did we get this far? Is there any way to put on the brakes? But he's not so much offering us prescriptions about what to do as kind of how we got to where we are. And the first idea in The Wisdom of the World is about the rejection of nature, you could say. But it goes from before Pythagoras, the Egyptians and Babylonians, all the way up to the 20th century. And then The Law of God, I think, is the other book. And that is talking about, I don't know, I haven't read it. I think it has to do with... That is
a great sales pitch.
Something about the rejection, the influence of God on Western culture, and yet how we've come to reject him. And then The Kingdom of Man is a phrase from Francis Bacon, and I think it's largely about the growth of the Enlightenment project in all this, and then the undoing of the Enlightenment project. So, he doesn't refer to C.S. Lewis a lot, but as you start to feel like, wow, this book sounds just like Abolition of Man, he'll drop in just a short quote or short reference that lets you know that he knows that he knows the argument is similar. It's just unbelievable, in my opinion. It's an extraordinary wealth of information and very eloquently written by certainly a like-minded friend. So it's a fantastic book. I recommend it to everybody.
You obviously aren't reading the whole trilogy in order, and so that's okay. You don't feel like you're walking into the middle of a conversation?
No, I guess I read The Wisdom of the World first because of my interest in natural philosophy. I was just so impressed with the breadth of his erudition. No, I think The Kingdom of Man stands on its own, but I think it'll draw you into questions of nature. And for those of us that I think feel we have ready assent to the idea that Christianity was once a very important force in the West and it's been lost to our detriment, he doesn't need to convince me of that. I'd like to see his chronicle, but this other stuff, there's just, in The Kingdom of Man, there's so much, he's so concise with his argument, and it parallels so many things that those of us in CC have talked about. I think we could pick that up as an independent book for sure, The Kingdom of Man.
Okay, that's good to know, because that looks like a pricey trilogy. We're not buying it used. I looked at the prices. That will not be the book I buy in the middle of the show.
Yeah.
And I can't afford to podcast if we start doing that.
It's funny because I had bought the other one, Wisdom of the World, because I was like, oh, this is germane to my studies. But that Kingdom of Man looked so good that I was like, I don't know if I can justify it. So it actually goes to my son, Judah, and my wife, Kelley, for buying it for me for Christmas present, I think. I had to say it for, but I think it was $40. Is that right?
Yeah. Actually, that's what I did. I clicked add to wish list. You may have twin Christmas presents in no time.
Yeah, there you go.
How about you, Brandy?
Well, mine, I may have used this before because I was reading this book in the spring and then I had to put it down for preparing to drop people off at college and plan school and all that kind of stuff. So I picked it back up and I'm in the middle of it. I only picked it back up this week. But it's Strangers in a Strange Land by Charles Chaput, who is the Archbishop of Philadelphia. And he is a fascinating guy to me. I've heard a number of interviews with him that I just have found him very interesting. But this book is amazing to me. I'm trying to figure out when it was published. I think it's one of his newer, he's written a few things, and I think it's his newest or one of his newer ones, but 2017. So it's not super old, but it's weird. It feels prophetic to read it because in the section that I'm in right now, he's talking about the prevalence of scientific fraud and basically the idea that once science gets to the point where it has influence over policy making, that doomed it. What does he say? He says it's bound to be flooded by opportunists and charlatans, whether it's the National Academy of Science or the Monastery of Cluny. I have no idea who Cluny is. I'm like, that's probably a joke. that I'm not getting. But anyway.
No. It is, in France. So.
Okay. I'm like, this is a joke Ravi would get. Anyway, so he's talking about like the weaponizing of the intellect, the goal of silencing different views. And he gets to this line or this paragraph that was so powerful. He says, I actually went and got the book just so I could read this to you guys. He says, so this is the fifth key feature of our common national life today. Malice wrapped in the language of tolerance, sensitivity, and rights. It consists in an appetite to use power not simply to prevail in political debate, but to humiliate and erase dissent and even its memory in reworking the cell structure of society. I mean, it was like a gut punch because I thought, oh my gosh, that's like only 2 paragraphs away from where he was talking about scientific fraud. And it's like, he was not talking about what we're seeing now, the scientific fraud, or just that doing things in the name of science when there's actually zero research to even back it up, but just using the word science as the magic wand for policymaking. It was so fascinating. And I hadn't thought before, I had not considered the idea that when we, instead of keeping science as something other than politics, when we allow science to cross over and start to have a powerful influence in politics, I hadn't considered that would increase the temptation for fraud. I'd already thought about it in terms of money and the idea that, like if you're doing a study, it's being financed by a pharmaceutical company, there would be a temptation to make that company look good because they are paying you. Like I understood that dynamic, but I had never thought about the idea that there's a whole other temptation that enters when it starts to have legislative type of influence. Anyway, it's fascinating. Such a good book.
Yeah. Brandy, do you guys subscribe to the Mars Audio Journal app? Do you have the Mars Audio Journal app?
I've thought about getting it, but I don't have it.
Because on the Mars Audio Journal app, there's a free thing called the Friday feature, even if you don't subscribe regularly to the journal.
Oh.
And in the spring, Ken Myers did a great series of interviews with people regarding COVID and science and politics and the way science gets used in politics. But he's got maybe 2 or 3 Friday features, like around the time. I think Michael Hanby was one of the people he interviewed. Yeah, I think if you're interested in that, man, it was some brilliant lectures on the kind of frauds committed in the name of science in the political sphere. And especially right now, obviously.
I will totally look it up. I'm very interested. On that note, let's transition to our topical discussion. And Ravi, we have been bringing you up every once in a while amongst ourselves, the 4 of us Scholé Sisters, ever since you talked briefly, and actually Kevin talked about this briefly too, but there's your time in China working with the classical schools there. I guess our first question, we really want to talk about this whole idea of Western culture, Christian culture, classical education, and how all those things interrelate. Are they the same? Are they different? Where do we draw lines? All that kind of stuff. To start off, we wanted to ask you, this project of classical education is very closely identified with what people call Western culture. And yet there you and Kevin, you were in the East teaching this to an Eastern context. What was that like? And what did you learn from them? And was it, quote, Western, like were you Westernizing the East when you were doing this? Or how do you view all of that in terms of what you guys were doing when you were in China?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I should preface my response to the question by saying that a lot of my focus in college was on studying international political economy. So that was my degree, was political science. I also was pre-med, which was just as many classes as the political science degree. So it kind of felt like a double major.
You had lots of free time.
Yeah, lots of free time. That's right. So the point is that I spent a lot of that time in that political science degree studying Asia and studying China, Japan, India, Southeast Asia. And I was also always interested in missions. And I think there's a strong sense about different waves of missions, how not to be an imperialist missionary, but how to be respectful for the culture. And I remember a little jingle once we discussed is what you're doing or thinking or saying, building trust or undermining trust. And we had a little song that we would sing about cross-cultural communication. And so I've always been very concerned about this since I was probably even before college, and even my conversion to Christianity when I was 15. I grew up in America. My mom is white. I grew up with her. My parents were divorced when I was young. My father's Indian. But I didn't have a chance to really get to know him or go to India for the first time until I was 13.
Oh, wow.
Going to India and experiencing that culture for a month and then coming back still left a very strong impression on me. And part of my conversion to Christianity involved thinking through the kind of multicultural issues or cross-cultural issues. And could Christ be true when there's so many people in the world that don't know about Christ? So that's always been kind of a big part of my own personal story, is trying to think through how Christ is about redeeming peoples that even haven't heard of him, and how that goes forth. Now, I think the reason why I bring that up is because as we were going to China for the first time, I was very, very apprehensive about being, you could say, a westernizing force in China. That's not what I wanted to be at all. Like, I wanted to advocate Christianity. I wanted to advocate the centrality of Christ in all things and those kinds of ideas, but I certainly didn't want to have that kind of Western imperialism that, I stayed away from throughout so many phases of my life. And there's been a number of things in working with the Chinese that I feel like revealed to me that there were some illusions I was holding on to about this idea that I had of Western imperialism. And I think, I'm not saying that couldn't be a thing, but it's not. I don't think it's what Christian classical education is up to. And I'll tell you why. I think that Christian classical education is focused on the Christian culture that rose up from Augustine through the medieval period and was in some ways started to be eroded in the 1600s and 1700s. I think that's what Christian classical education is really interested in, the culture of the church. And the continuing legacy of the culture of the church, even up through today, as it's dispersed and maybe not united, but still growing and changing. If you think about Dorothy Sayers, for example, her interest is really in medieval Christianity, medieval Christian culture, the trivium as it was instituted then. I mean, Latin as the lingua franca of learning in medieval Christendom and those kinds of things. Part of why I was attracted to Christian classical education, even from the background that was very invested in many foreign cultures, was because I saw that at the core of Christian classical education was the desire to see Christ exalted in all things, in all subjects. Why is Christ significant? How is Christ Lord of all of our ideas and all of history? I think that's what Christians want. That's not a particularly Western thing. That's a Christian thing. And the thing about medieval Christendom is they were a large group of people that were trying to do that. So they were trying to see Christ exalted in all things. And were they perfect? No, they were certainly imperfect in lots of ways. But yet there was a coherence about what they were up to that we've totally lost. And so if we're trying to re-find our way, it's best to go back to the last place you felt like somebody was on the path. And
good point.
I think that's why historic Orthodox Christianity, and especially kind of as it kind of blossomed in the medieval period, is the core of place of recovery for Christian classical education, not necessarily Greece and Rome, as I think I first thought when I was exposed to Christian classical education. The thing that I realized in working with the Chinese is that that's what the Chinese knew too. The Chinese actually knew that was what they were after, that they were after continuity with historic Christian culture, and that the only people in the Christian church or in the West that are still trying to do that are Christian classical educators. So that revelation was really helpful for me. There was one particular conversation I had, I remember, with one of their thought leaders. His name is Su Bingsen. It was about the sinification of Christianity. From all of the points of view that I had kind of grown up with, the idea of the sinicization of Christianity would be a good thing. We would see an indigenous form of Christianity in China. Like, that sounds good. But he said, it's actually been really insidious in China, the way it gets used. Because what happened is the Marxist Chinese government, communist government, has said, okay, religion's okay. There are 5 allowed religions here in China: Buddhism, Islam, Catholicism, Protestantism. I think maybe, I don't know if they consider Confucianism a religion or is Taoism. But there are 5 allowed religions here in China. And so as long as you're one of those approved religions, that's fine. We're not going to overtly persecute you. But we do want you to have an authentic Chinese version of your religion. And so then this became very interesting and kind of surprising in what ends up happening, because they essentially, would go through Christian doctrine, and then they would say, these kinds of doctrines are allowed, but these doctrines are not allowed, or this doctrine is not authentically Chinese, and this doctrine is authentically Chinese.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so the Christian churches in China started to say, you know what? We can't make up these doctrines or change them. We can only receive them as they've been passed down to us from the Christians that have gone before us. Mm-hmm. So I think around 2015, Wang Yi, who's a professor of constitutional law before he became a pastor, he said, we can't make all these concessions to the Chinese government and change Christianity. We're not in a position to change Christianity, and we need to take a stand. And so he wrote, along with some other elders at that church and other leaders in China, the 95 Theses of the Chinese House Church. And some of the key theses of the 95 Theses of the Chinese House Church movement were that we can't make Christianity fit some Chinese mold. We have to accept Christianity has been passed down to us from the apostles, church fathers, from the creeds, as we've received it. It suddenly hit me that, yes, of course, it's something that we receive. It's not something that we can just synthesize or change however we want. The experience that they had was that was being used as a weapon against historic Orthodox Christianity. So many of these revelations along the way really surprised me. They had to fight, for example, to be able to treat Augustine as a church father and to treat John Calvin with respect they felt like was due him, or Luther, because they weren't Chinese people. So it hadn't occurred to me how the idea of contextualization into a culture could be turned on its head to try to change doctrine or dogma.
Well, because it seems like then it made, I don't know what you would call it. I don't know if you would just call it being Chinese or Chinese culture, or but like that became the authority.
Yeah.
Instead of the church being the authority.
Yeah. And then the interesting thing is who gets to decide on what Chinese culture is, right?
Right.
Because the people in charge right now, 10% of China are members of the Communist Party. In fact, people say there's more Christians in China now than there are members of the Communist Party. I think the New York Times may have reported that about 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Now, the strange thing is, Chinese Communist Party is atheist, officially atheist. And so do they get to decide for the other 90% of China what Chinese culture is?
Right. Well, they haven't been around that long. I mean, my husband's grandparents were missionaries there during the revolution and they were kicked out. But I mean, we knew people who were alive when this happened, and it's really not traditional Chinese culture. This is new.
Yeah, that's right. So in fact, I was talking to a Chinese friend today, a young man, and he said that he's very worried about China because everybody's so materialist. This man is not a Christian, but he said everybody's so materialist. I'm worried about my friends and the future of China because they don't seem to be connected to anything bigger than, just making money. And that's a part of the conversation, is how that's not necessarily been part of traditional Chinese thought. There's certainly people like Confucius or Lao Tzu or Chu Shi that have great visions of transcendent ideals that are spiritually minded at some level, if not Christian. They're definitely not just materialists. So do these people get ruled out because Marxism is a materialist vision of the world? Who gets to decide what Chinese culture is?
It's funny, the materialism part of it almost sounds like the worst part of the West to me.
Oh, no.
Because that's what we complain about here, is the rampant materialism and the denial of anything beyond mass and matter.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so that's one of the things that, the other thing is that in some ways, they're more modern than we are, that China is. And they've already been westernized, if you want to think about it in terms of that. I mean, we're talking about Marxism is what the dominant ideology over there, or some kind of technocrat bureaucracy, So they've just picked up the worst problems of the West without having the Christian kind of foundation out of which these grew to combat those problems. And I think some of the challenge, in China in particular, is that Mao eradicated all religion. So they also don't have other natively Chinese versions of non-materialistic things like Taoism or Buddhism, which isn't native to China either, but still older in China, to combat materialism. Now all that's left is materialism.
Wow.
So I think, what's interesting to me, though, is the growth of Christianity in China. I mean, man, it's just remarkable. And I think there are a lot of brilliant Chinese people, and they've got a rich and old culture. And it's not that hard to scratch the surface of that materialism and for them to be really upset by it too, for them to want more. This may be part of God's plan for China, is just the exposing, our human need for him. And then what happens is that Christians, if you've got 100 million Christians, and it's a lot of conversions. It's just amazing how quickly Christianity is growing in China through conversions. And so they get to be 20, 30 years old. They have children, and they say, how do we want to educate our kids? We certainly don't want to educate them as atheists, as would happen if we went to the public schools or the state schools. And so then how do we educate them? And they recognize that the battle for Christianity is they want to be true to what it means to be a Christian. And they recognize that they can't just make it up. They've got to receive the scriptures. These things have been discussed and studied for generations, and they want a wise and authentic expression of Christianity. And so they look at the contemporary Christian church and recognize that a lot of the things that are going on in the contemporary Christian church are, somewhat symptomatic of modern culture, of modernity, of expressions of too much individual autonomy and things like that. And some of these guys are really brilliant thinkers and scholars, and they can see kind of the demise of the West coming. And they're saying, we don't want that. We don't want kind of the end of the Enlightenment vision that's about to fail. We want the Christian culture that birthed science. We want the Christian culture that birthed democracy. We don't want just some pale version of natural science, some pale version of democracy that's going to end up on the shoals, crushed by the rocks. We want a robust Christian culture that could still support something like democracy or natural philosophy. At that point, once I realized that these guys were in it for the right reasons, that they recognized the problems with the modern West, and they weren't trying to imitate the modern West, but they did believe there was a richness in Christian culture that they wanted to receive. And at that point, I do believe that they're going to find an authentic Chinese expression of it, but it just can't be forced, and it might take a long time,
The idea of the West precedes Christianity. We have the Greeks and the Romans and all that kind of stuff. But then I hear you making a distinction between Christian culture and the West in a modern sense. Was there a time where we could conflate the two, do you think? Or have they always been running parallel?
And so I don't know what I was reading. It may have actually been The Kingdom of Man by Ravi Jain recently, but I think it actually said the idea of the West was born in the 19th century.
Oh.
And I think before that, you do have Christendom, earlier. And I don't actually even remember the other things, but I think that the idea was that Christianity is about redemption. As much as each of us individually need to be redeemed, also our networks of relationships need to be redeemed. How we practice love is going to depend on more than one person loving a second person, but it's going to depend on the mutual love between those two persons. And how that plays out into a network of relationships, network of institutions. The pattern of Christianity wasn't to destroy all those networks and institutions that preceded it, but the pattern of Christianity was to redeem those institutions. So if you look at Roman law, for example, Roman law is largely brought into Christian thought with the Code of Justinian.
Yeah.
It's not exactly the same. There's some sifting that's done, but it's just Augustine's plundering the Egyptians, that wherever truth is found, it belongs to Christ, our master. And so there's the sense that the Greco-Roman world was the first scene of redemption. You see all this inheritance we have from the Greco-Roman world, but it was understood as part of Christ's transformation of the world. And, we think of Germany now as, kind of part of the West, part of Christian Europe. But that was kind of late in coming, So I forget, St. Boniface, 8th century, cutting down the great oak that the Germans worshipped. And, Charlemagne and the growth of Christianity in Germany is later than the growth of Christianity in the Mediterranean. And certainly the Scandinavian countries are after that. Patrick's evangelization of the Irish. There's all these nations that we think of as Christian Europe. There is a process of redemption for all of them, all of the nations being brought in to the kingdom of Christ.
Yeah.
It's just a great wealth now. But I think there's a way that we mix up the idea of the Western canon with the heritage of the church.
Yeah.
Matthew Arnold in the late 19th century, I think, is kind of one of these pivotal figures where he's holding on to this idea of the West, or he wants some kind of idea of the West without the church. And I think that's part of where the early 20th century was trying to go. But I'm not sure that it's viable. I think in some ways that's an experiment, and I'm not sure that it can hold.
So it's not the heritage of the West, it's the heritage of the church, which we should be educating our children in, and then that's transferable around the world.
Yeah, and for me, that really was a shift that I don't think I had fully made until getting ready to go to China, having been to China and returning from China. And I think we realized we already believed that, at least me and Kevin had already believed that. And I think a lot of people in Christian classical education already believe that too. But we just had not been able to fully express it in a lot of ways. And then we had talked about Western culture as a good, Christian culture as a good. They're both goods, but they're different goods, and let's keep them both. And I think what we're really talking about is the transformed Christian culture, the way Christian culture has transformed Greco-Roman culture. And that's what we're most interested in. That book I almost recommended, but I decided on Remy Brague's book instead, is a book called Dominion by Tom Holland. Have you either of you heard of this book?
It sounds familiar to me for some reason. I haven't read it, though.
This one's new as of 2019 or 2020. And he was a scholar of the classical world of Greece and Rome, and he's an accomplished writer, historian, with Persia as well. In all of his studies, this man is not a Christian. I think he may be agnostic or atheist. He spent most of his life as a classicist and wrote well-acclaimed books about the ancients. And he said, but he started to realize that he did not identify with them, and that the more he read about the Greeks or the Romans, the more he felt how foreign they were and how different their values were from his values. And he said, I finally realized that I'm in most respects a Christian, even though I don't believe in Christ. And that the world I most identify with is the world that has been given to us by Christianity. So this book, Dominion, is essentially a follow-up to his book on Persia, his follow-up to the book on the Greeks. And it's a history of the world from, maybe you could say the history of the church from a little bit after time of Christ all the way up to the 20th century. It's just talking about episodes in the life of the church where it helped establish the trajectory of the Christian church and how that sets the trajectory for who we are today in the 21st century. It's a fascinating book. I mean, I think the last episode is something about Angela Merkel thinking through immigration in Germany in 2016 and how that relates to Christian history. It's a fascinating book.
Well, that's another one for my list. You're an expensive guest, Ravi.
I know. But I think it really just, in some ways, it's really where we as Christian classical educators need to end up, because it's not the West for the sake of the West. It's that in the West we're the first creators of the gospel, where we saw what redeemed institutions, what redeemed network of relationships, what redeemed language started to look like. So I think the Chinese Christians are all about that. They're very interested in that.
So then do they draw on, I don't know, I'm thinking of this whole plundering the Egyptians, like the early Christians took Plato and Aristotle and certain great thinkers, and they took so much of the good from them. Are the Chinese doing that with, I don't know, like Confucius or, some of their other great thinkers that they have produced? Is there some of that going on? Maybe not in their little Christian classical schools, but amongst, the teachers or their scholars, is any of that happening?
Yeah, it's really funny to talk to them about that because they're not very interested in that. So I found myself in the position of talking to them about neoconfucianism or things like that. And for them to just say, that's interesting, but it's not very helpful to us. This isn't where we live. And there's a couple things that I found interesting about that. One is I think it's true that the contemporary Chinese person knows very little about ancient Chinese thought or medieval Chinese thought. And so it's almost irrelevant to talk to them about it as a way into anything profound or deep because they have to learn all that first. But then on the other side, because a lot of the people that are involved in Christian classical education in China are very smart, a lot of them are scholars in their own right. For example, one of them is a scholar of ancient Chinese, and this was shocking to me, but at the first conference on Christian classical education in China that was convened by the Association of Chinese Christian Classical Schools, this scholar of ancient Chinese language said that the best way that we can teach our children Chinese today is by helping them learn to read the Bible in Chinese, and they should read missionary biographies in Chinese.
Wow.
Now, this is a man that travels throughout China giving lectures on ancient Chinese poetry and things like that.
Wow.
Can analyze it inside and out. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I think he said that. One is that the early translations of the Chinese Bible had elegant Chinese and were very good Chinese and are a great way to connect kids to that. The other thing is that some of the Chinese missionary biographies start to show the beginnings of the confrontation of Christian thought with kind of historic Chinese culture that the kids have no context for anymore. So that's also very interesting. The other thing I noticed about this fellow is that he gave another talk. And when he gave this other talk, he gave a talk about a Chinese poem, and he analyzed the Chinese poem in Christian terms. Suddenly, I realized that he's doing natively, without even thinking about it, exactly what I would like them to be doing. He's using an ancient Chinese poem to talk about Christianity and help everybody just kind of appreciate poetry, appreciate nature, appreciate God's governance of nature and things like that. And so it was an odd mix because I think there's a way they don't want to be pushed into this. They're going to resist people saying, oh, you should draw from Confucius because Confucius is just like Aristotle and Lao Tzu is just like Plato and all these, they don't like those kinds of comparisons because they feel like they're somewhat artificial. And yet on the other hand, they're naturally doing it in ways that are much more subtle, much more effective, much faster than we would think about doing it, if that makes sense.
It does. And actually, as you were describing all this, it made me wonder if maybe some of the difference is just that, someone like Augustine was an immediate heir of Greek and Rome because of the culture he was living in and the empire he's living under, maybe in a way that they don't feel that they are because of this sort of secular interruption of their culture that has lasted almost 100 years.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Because I'm thinking, Augustine, his childhood was filled with the Greeks and Romans, so then it would have been natural for him to do that, which is what you're saying this guy's doing with his poetry expertise.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's a passage in Chesterton that I've heard before, but I don't have on the tip of my tongue, but it's something like the idols of nature worship had to be swept out of Europe before St. Francis could call the moon his sister and call the birds his family or something like that. Before he could have reverence again for nature, there's almost like a sweeping out of the nature worship of the Greeks and the Romans that had to occur, destruction of the idols. And when I've talked to my friends in China about plundering the Chinese sources, plundering the Egyptians in China, they say that there's a darkness that they feel. At least one of them expressed to me that there's a darkness that she feels in Chinese thought when she thinks about it herself, whereas she has a lot of hope in Christ and in Christianity. And I think there's almost a sense that some lingering Confucianism maybe that she may have experienced, or the way it was used for her was very negative, maybe legalistic, that led her to a place she could never perform well enough. And then there's another person that expressed it in a way that I thought was very interesting. It was like, we know Chinese culture is great. Chinese culture is amazing. The problem is that we as Chinese are too proud. We're too proud of Chinese culture. And we need to find our joy and our hope in Jesus, not in Chinese culture. So it's like these fascinating things that have made me realize I just need to be a little careful. My ideal of non-Western imperialism, because what they're really after is Christ. And if they see Christ having transformed particular patterns of thought and ways of being in Europe, in America, in the West, and they want to see that Christian thought, those Christian institutions, those Christian patterns, and they happen to be in the West right now, and that's what they're after, I'm not going to stop them and say, no, you can't do that because that's Western.
Right.
And so it's been fascinating to me. I mean, I've been a little bit embarrassed about how much there is in the Western Christian tradition that I've had to make amends with, because the Chinese Christians are after it, because they see it as a source of freedom, as a source of joy, as a source of wisdom that I hadn't recognized yet. I mean, political philosophy, I just remember there's one Chinese intellectual who's not a Christian who's fascinated by traditional American conservatism in the vein of Russell Kirk and Robert Nisbet. And, he says, this is what we need in China. And now this man is risking his life for this. Again, this fellow is not a Christian, but he has a lot of respect for the Christian church in China, because he sees the Christian church as instantiating a realm of freedom, a realm where their consciences are open, their consciences are free, they're not bound by mere authority or bureaucracy. So this Chinese scholar had a lot of praise, effusive praise for the Christian church in China, even though he wasn't a Christian, because he saw it as a place of real freedom that you can't have almost anywhere else in China. And that scholar, one of the best expressions he thinks of that is in, the American conservative political tradition. In some ways, I was just embarrassed because that I don't know more about what he's talking about, that I don't draw more boldly upon these things and recognize that, man, these men like Russell Kirk are drawing from these deep wells of Christian thought and Christian history. And this is not like a narrowly Western conservative idea, like Western Republican thing. This is the end of a lot of thought by deep Christians over the course of 2 millennia. I shouldn't be afraid of it because it might be a political hot button or something.
Yeah, I am also right now reading On Christian Teaching by Augustine. He says in there that there are things that, as far as realms of knowledge or institutions, there are institutions that man creates, and then there are those that he discovers or observes. So many of the truths or the ideas that we take from the ancients, like Aristotle, Plato, are the things that they just observed accurately.
Yeah.
So it's okay to take those ideas. They aren't of their culture particularly, or they weren't made by those people for those people. They're just the way things are, and they pointed it out first.
Yeah.
And so it's okay to take them. Yep. And so the same would apply in other cultures as well.
Yeah, they're plundering the Americans right now, the Chinese. the Chinese Christians,
Oh, wow.
And I want to give them everything we've got, I think they may actually be a better hope for the future of Christendom than we are at this point.
Well, that kind of brings me to my next question, because we saw this huge iconoclastic movement over the summer. And by the end of the summer, what I was seeing in the homeschool community at large was this pressure, one homeschooler putting on another, pressuring each other to try to back away from their Western, and nobody ever said Christian, but I'll touch on that in a minute. But like just to back away from this tradition of the West, to back away from their inheritance. And like I told you before the show, I mean, I wasn't even sure how they're defining the West, because if they mean, like secular materialism, then I'm all in,
Yeah, exactly.
But it was always really vague. Seemed to be a rejection of the Republic at times. Yeah. But it was interesting because then what was being pushed towards was that you need to go back to some sort of almost tribal religion or something. I don't know. It was sort of fascinating to me to watch at the end of the summer. So then in the midst of all of that, even though it never said it was anti-Christian, my husband, for example, went to a meeting where he tried to speak out against having a statue of Father Sarah removed in the town where he works, which then was removed. They brought it down. And I do think one of the reasons why they took it down was because they didn't want it to be destroyed. But Father Sarah is the Spanish missionary who founded the missions up and down the state of California. Probably the first real Christian doing missionary work in California. Anyway, so he's quite famous. There's a lot of places named after him. There's statues of him all over all up and down the state. And they're all slowly disappearing. So that's my context that I'm speaking from, as I'm seeing this rejection of the West. Actually, it's being a rejection of our history, but also the Christian history, at least the way we've experienced it personally, has been a rejection of the Christian history of the state, not just any old history of the state.
Yeah.
So we're seeing this at this weird government historical level, but we're also seeing it even in the curriculum. You need to take the West out of your curriculum, whatever that means, and put something else in, whatever that means. There's no set definition for any of this conversation. And then you're telling me that Chinese are coming here, they see something valuable, and they're plundering everything they can. I don't know if this is happening at the Christian school level, but it is definitely happening amongst homeschoolers. Like, what will you want to speak into this chaos?
So,
like, do you have any words of insight to homeschoolers walking through this whole mess?
Well, here's another thing that may blow you away. Do you know that in China, in the Christian community, that they, at least the ones that I know, celebrate Thanksgiving?
Like the American Thanksgiving?
They celebrate the American Thanksgiving because they see it as God's providence to protect a group of believers that were in danger and establish, a beacon of light for the world. And so they celebrate American Thanksgiving.
That's amazing.
I know, exactly. And, it's like, I'm astounded. I've had to be stripped of my multiculturalism. I've had to be stripped. In fact, in China, I've just got to say, I pray for Pastor Wang Yi, who's in prison now for 9 more years because he stood up to the Chinese government about these things on a very, very large scene, very international level. I got to hear him speak a number of times and got to meet him while I was there. But he said, we're not an international church. His church was not an international church. He said, we will welcome people. We'll welcome people if they're coming to visit us from other places. But the reason why we welcome them is because we're a Catholic church. We are part of the Holy Catholic Church. Out of many, we are one. We are brought together through Christ. And I think it was the first time I started to realize that this Catholicity is a bigger idea than multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is a postmodern idea. And what we need is multiracial, multi-ethnic Catholicity. God is reconciling barbarians and Scythians, Jews and Greeks. He is reconciling all races and all nations. But it isn't a one cult. It isn't a one worship, one culture that we're being formed. That's the culture of the church. It's the culture of the body of Christ. This heritage that we've had, this 2 millennium of thought on that, and the Jewish history before that, we have got to preserve the wisdom in that, in the political tradition, in the philosophical tradition that's been largely Western Christendom. And I think there's a lot to Eastern Christendom too, so I don't want to exclude Eastern Christendom from this. And I think when we start talking about the culture of the church, it's a natural way to have a rapprochement with Eastern Christendom. But a lot of the political history really has been in Western Christendom, and a lot of natural science, natural philosophical thought has been Western Christian thought. And we've got to preserve that. Around the world, America is still respected in places like Malawi, in places like Cambodia, in places like India. America is still highly respected. People still have a lot of respect for Americans. And I think they have respect for Americans because they see it as a place where the rule of law is important. They see it as a place where people from all different ethnicities can be accepted, and that's always been a part of the American story. They see it as a place where people have a voice through democracy. And I just don't get people that hate America. I feel like people that hate America just haven't traveled. They haven't been exposed to many parts of the world. In most parts of the world, they would love the chance to go to America, to live in America, to be a part of America. At any rate, there's just so much there worth preserving and celebrating. And I think, we need to dig deeper into where some of these good things came from so we can preserve them, because we really are on the verge of losing them.
Yeah.
And I think if we lose them, we're going to end up a lot more like a totalitarian state, which is what China's
right.
These Christians in China are fighting against.
One of the conversations we had this summer as a family, we just kind of ended with this idea that really the problems that we're having are mainly because either at some point we've failed to live up to our ideals, or we've forgotten what they are. It's not that really there was a problem with our ideals.
Right.
Like when we talk about things like, oh, so-and-so owned slaves. And I agree, owning another human being is abhorrent. But when we actually read through our founding documents, it's hard to see how slavery even has a place there. Like you can tell that the ideal was marching toward freedom for all people just by the way that it's written. And so, I don't know. I know for me, I came to the conclusion of kind of exactly what you're saying. We need to know more about this and try to live up to the high standards that were set and live it out fully in ways that they maybe weren't brave enough to do, or politically it wasn't going to work at that time or whatever. But we need to be more the way we were intended to be, not less.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And, as Christians, we're always in tension with, our current reality. There's always things that we're going to be blind to as Christians of our own, kind of besetting sins of our generation. But yeah, exactly. The point is to continue to be the Wilberforces of each generation and to oppose injustice as much as we can as it becomes apparent. But on the other hand, we can't just deny the fact that we've gotten to where we are because other people did that too before us. And we're reaping the benefits of what they accomplished. Each incremental step has been a step forward.
I still have so many questions about those Chinese schools and how they're all working, but it's getting late, so we're going to have to save it we just have to keep having you on and asking you about China until we get to all our questions.
Yeah. Well, do pray for the Chinese church and pray for the schools in China, because I think they're under a lot of stress right now with not only COVID and coronavirus, but also, with China cracking down more seriously, religion and education. So,
yeah.
Okay.
But I will talk about them as many times as you would like, Brandy. So,
all right. Well, it was good talking to you guys.
You too. Thanks so much for hosting the conversation.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. Remember, most of our episodes have cutting room floor bonuses where you can hear some of the good parts that didn't make the final cut. There was quite a bit on the floor for this episode. To listen, all you have to do is join Scholé Sisters sistership at either supporters or Sophie level. Go to scholésisters.com/sistership to sign up. All of the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked in our show notes. Just go to scholésisters.com/ss79 to check it out. Our next episode is all about physical training. While we were all together in Phoenix, Misty, Abby, Pam, and I took the time to chat about the gymnastics section of the liberal arts tradition and why physical training is not extracurricular. And of course, Abby, the only one of us who is truly in shape, made us all feel badly. It was great. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
And Misty, are you in California?
I'm in Washington. So we try to be as much like California as we can.
Right.
It's good to have goals. It really is. I'll probably send out the cap too, come to think of it.
Yeah. They have many more friends than I do. So